There's a particular smell that comes with a house that's been loved for a long time. Lemon oil on old hardwood, the faint trace of cedar from the closet in the hallway. Coffee that's been brewed in the same corner of the same kitchen for more than 2 decades. My parents' house had that smell, and I grew up thinking it was just what home smelled like. It took me years to understand it was the smell of people who stayed, who maintained, who chose that one place over and over again and poured themselves into it season after season until the walls held them as much as they held the walls. My mother grew up in Fredericton. My father came from a small town outside of Thunder Bay that most people have never heard of. They met in their mid-20s, married young, by today's standards, and bought their house in Oakville, Ontario the year I turned 2. They didn't buy it because it was glamorous. They bought it because the backyard had a maple tree, and my mother said a house with a maple tree was a house worth keeping. My father laughed when she said that. He told me the story so many times I can hear his exact laugh when I think about it now. They kept that house for 26 years. Not effortlessly. Not without sacrifice. My father worked in logistics management, a job that sounds more comfortable than it was. He traveled 3 weeks out of every 4 for almost a decade when I was in elementary school. My mother worked part-time at a dental office and full-time at everything else. School pickups, hockey practices, parent council meetings, renovations she planned herself because they couldn't afford to hire anyone. She retiled the bathroom herself when I was 12. I handed her the grout. I thought we were just doing a project together. I didn't understand until much later that we were doing it. Because there was no other option. When I was 31, they sat me down at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd done 10 years of homework, where we'd eaten Christmas dinners and argued about curfews and celebrated every birthday I'd ever had. And my father slid a manila folder across to me. Inside was a property transfer document, a letter from their lawyer, and a handwritten note from my mother that I still have, still in the same envelope, in the drawer of my nightstand. They were moving to Kelowna. My father's sister had been there for years, and my parents had always talked about retiring somewhere with more sun. They weren't leaving out of sadness. They were leaving because they'd built something solid enough to leave behind, my mother said. We want you to have it before we're gone, while we can still see you in it. I didn't cry immediately. I sat there holding the folder, and the room went very quiet, and then I cried for a long time. I moved into the house 6 weeks later. My husband moved in with me. We had been married for 14 months at that point. We met through mutual friends, dated for 2 years, got engaged, got married in a small ceremony at a winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. He was funny and warm, and he had this way of listening when you talked that made you feel like what you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. I loved that about him. I still love that about him, which is part of what made everything that followed so genuinely painful to navigate. I told him everything about the house, every detail. The maple tree my mother picked it for, the bathroom she retiled by hand, the decade of travel my father endured so the mortgage payments never missed. I sat with him at that kitchen table and told him the whole story, and he reached across and held my hand and said he understood exactly what this place meant. I believed him. I think I needed to believe him. And for the first 8 months, there was no reason to doubt it. The first sign was easy to miss. It was October, and we were driving back from his parents' place after Thanksgiving dinner. His mother lived about 40 minutes away, in a 2-bedroom condo in Mississauga she'd moved into after his parents divorced 8 years earlier. She was a woman who filled rooms, loud in a way that could read as warmth if you weren't paying attention, and forceful in a way that could read as enthusiasm if you gave her the benefit of the doubt. I had given her a great deal of benefit of the doubt. On the drive home, my husband mentioned that she'd been having some trouble with her upstairs neighbor. Noise complaints, a dispute over parking. He said she found the condo stressful lately. I said I was sorry to hear that. And I was. It sounded genuinely unpleasant. A few weeks later, he mentioned it again. She was looking into other options. The rental market was brutal. He said it almost as a statement of fact, not aimed at anything in particular. I agreed that the rental market was brutal, because it was. In December, he said her lease was up in March. I turned to look at him. I asked him what he meant by that, exactly. He said he was just keeping me informed. But the way he said it, the particular flatness in his voice, the way he didn't quite meet my eyes, I felt something shift in the room the same way air pressure shifts before a storm. You don't see it, you feel it in your ears. By January, the comments had become a conversation. He thought we could convert the den into a proper guest room. His mother was good with kids, which felt pointed since we had recently discussed the possibility of starting a family. She would be around more anyway for holidays, he said. It made sense for her to have a space that felt like hers when she visited. I asked him how long these visits would last. He said, she'd just stay a few months, see how it goes. I asked him when he had been planning to discuss this with me as a genuine question rather than an announcement with extra steps. He said he didn't understand why I was getting upset. He said we had plenty of room. I said the question wasn't about room. He said, this is our home, right? Not just yours? That sentence landed differently than I think he intended it to. Or maybe it landed exactly as he intended, and he simply hadn't considered what it would sound like from where I was standing. I don't know. What I know is that I felt something close behind me quietly, like a door clicking shut, and I chose not to respond immediately, because the things I wanted to say in that moment were too large and too irreversible, and I had learned, over 31 years, to wait for the version of myself that speaks in sentences rather than in the raw first draft of hurt feelings. I told him I needed a few days to think. He seemed surprised by that. I don't think he expected me to need time. I think he expected me to fold or to argue, and either response would have kept us inside the structure of a conversation he had already planned. Asking for time moved us outside of it. I could see him recalibrate. His mother came for what was described as a weekend visit at the end of January. She arrived on Friday evening with her regular overnight bag and a very large tote that I noticed but didn't comment on. By Sunday morning, she had reorganized the spice cabinet, suggested that the living room furniture would benefit from being rotated, and asked me whether we'd considered updating the kitchen backsplash. I said I liked the backsplash. She said she was only thinking about resale value. I said we weren't planning to sell. She smiled in the way people smile when they think you're being naive. On Sunday afternoon, while my husband was shoveling the front walk, we'd had a significant snowfall overnight, the kind that buries Oakville in white and makes everything look briefly innocent. His mother came to find me in the kitchen. She sat down at the table without being invited to sit. She folded her hands in front of her. She had the specific posture of someone who had rehearsed what she was about to say and was committing to the performance. She talked about how much she valued family closeness. She talked about how hard it was to age alone. She talked about my husband's generous heart and how she had always hoped his partner would share that generosity. She talked about how practical it was for family to support one another, especially now, given what housing costs had become. Every sentence was engineered to make disagreement sound like selfishness, and I recognized the engineering even while I was sitting inside it. Then she held out her hand, palm up, in the unmistakable gesture of someone expecting something to be placed in it. She asked me for a copy of the house keys. Not a spare for emergencies, a copy for herself to keep. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator ran. Snow slid from the maple tree outside and landed against the window with a soft sound, and I felt in that exact moment something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not panic, something more like clarity. The specific, crystalline clarity that comes when you have been watching something move toward you slowly for a long time, and it has finally arrived close enough to see clearly. I looked at her outstretched hand. I looked at her face, which held the expression of someone who had never been told no in a way that actually stuck. And I felt the beginning of a smile move across my face. Not a polite smile, not a nervous smile. The quiet, grounded smile of a woman who knows something the other person in the room doesn't know yet. I set down my tea. I straightened in my chair. I said, I think before we go any further, there are some things you should probably know. My voice was even. That surprised me a little. She lowered her hand slightly but didn't withdraw it. She was still waiting, in the practiced way of someone who assumes patience always gets rewarded. My husband had come in through the back door, stomping snow off his boots in the mudroom. I heard him stop when he heard my voice. He knew something was different. I don't know what he heard exactly, maybe nothing more than my tone. But he went still in the way people go still, when they understand that something is happening that they no longer have control over. I told her that I wanted to make sure we were all starting from the same understanding, because I could see we weren't. I told her that this house was not a shared asset in our marriage, that it had come to me, alone, through a legal property transfer from my parents, and that my name only, was on the title. I told her that my father had worked in logistics for 30 years and spent a decade traveling away from his family so that this mortgage could be paid, and that my mother had spent those same years maintaining this house with her own hands in ways that most people would have hired out and that when they transferred this property to me, they weren't giving me a piece of real estate. They were giving me the accumulated weight of their lives, and I did not take that lightly. And I was not going to treat it lightly now, just because the conversation happening at my kitchen table had assumed I would. Her hand dropped. It didn't drift down slowly. It dropped, the way something drops when the signal holding it up simply stops arriving. The expression on her face, the composed, practiced confidence she'd worn since Friday evening, went through several things very quickly. First, a kind of stillness. Then something paler. Then the specific look of a person who has walked into a room expecting it to be arranged one way and found it arranged completely differently. My husband said my name, just my name. He said it from the doorway of the kitchen, still in his coat, melting snow dropping onto the tiles, and I turned to look at him. I told him I loved him. I said that first because I meant it and because I needed it to be in the room before anything else I said. I told him that our home was ours. I agreed with that completely. What we built together, what we chose together, what we grew into this house together, that was ours. But this house was not something we built together. This house was something my parents built. And those were not the same category, and somewhere between October and January, he had quietly reclassified them as the same category, and I needed him to understand that I had noticed, and that it wasn't going to stand. I went to the drawer beside the stove. The shallow one where I kept the important documents, the insurance papers, the property transfer folder my father had organized, with the same precise care he organized everything. And I brought the folder to the table. I opened it to the title page. I set it in front of them both, and I pointed once to the line that held one name. Mine. His mother looked at the document for a long time. She looked at it in the way people look at something that has revised their understanding of a situation they thought they had fully mapped. My husband looked at it too. And something in the way he was standing changed. A slow release of something he had been holding. Something that had, I think, always known it was on shaky ground, but had hoped the ground wouldn't be tested this directly. I told his mother that she was welcome in our home as a guest. And I meant that genuinely. I told her the guest room was available when she visited, and I had no desire to create distance between my husband and his family. I told her I understood that housing costs in the GTA were genuinely difficult, and I didn't have contempt for the situation she was in. But I told her that the conversation about a key, about a permanent room, about restructuring the space my parents sacrificed decades to protect, that conversation was finished. It had ended when she held out her hand. And she would leave today with a clear understanding of where things stood. She left that afternoon, not with anger, which I think she might have preferred because anger is easier to argue back against. She left with something quieter, a recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when they realize the situation was never what they assumed it was. My husband drove her to her condo. He was gone for just over an hour. When he came home, he didn't say anything immediately. He hung up his coat. He took off his boots. He came and sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at the wood grain of it for a while. When he spoke, he said he should have talked to me before any of this started. Not after it was in motion. Not once it had already arrived at my front door with a tote bag. Before. I told him he was right. He said he knew that now in a way he hadn't before. He said that he had spent so many years managing his mother's expectations and absorbing her anxiety that he had stopped noticing when he was doing it. He said it had become a kind of default, a background setting he hadn't examined in a long time. I told him I understood that. I told him I wasn't asking him to stop caring about his mother, or to cut her off or to choose me over her in some absolute permanent way. I was asking him to understand the difference between his family and mine, and to stop quietly treating those two things as interchangeable without consulting me. He said that was fair. I told him fair wasn't the standard I was going for. I told him what I actually wanted was for us to start having real conversations before things arrived at my kitchen table fully formed. I told him I didn't want to be the last person to know about decisions that lived in my own home. He nodded slowly. And then he said something that surprised me. He said that for most of his life, keeping the peace with his mother had meant absorbing things before they could become conflicts. Quietly accommodating, quietly redirecting, quietly managing. He said he had gotten so used to that pattern that he had imported it into our marriage without realizing that what worked, or what passed for working, with his mother was not how a marriage was supposed to function. I thought about that for a while before I responded. I told him I was glad he said it out loud. I told him that the version of him who had just said that out loud was the version I had married, and I needed that version to be the one who showed up at the table when things were difficult. He reached across and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything else. Sometimes that's the most honest response. We spent the following few weeks in the kind of conversations that feel uncomfortable in the way that necessary things always feel uncomfortable. The way it feels to finally clean out a space that you've been avoiding, because you know it's going to take time and effort, and you're going to find things you'd rather not have to look at. We talked about boundaries. We talked about the patterns in his relationship with his mother and how long they'd been running. We talked about what we both actually wanted this marriage to look like, not in theory but in practice, on ordinary Tuesdays when no one was watching. It was hard. It was also the most honest I had felt in our relationship in over a year. His mother was civil with me after that. Not warm, not right away, but civil in the careful and deliberate way of someone who has recalibrated and is now choosing their steps more carefully. She came for a weekend in March, and she didn't touch the spice cabinet, and she didn't mention the backsplash, and when she left, she said goodbye to me directly instead of around me. I'll take it. Genuine civility is not nothing. It's actually closer to honesty than performed warmth usually is. Performed warmth asks you to feel something. Genuine civility just asks you to acknowledge the reality of the situation. I can work with reality. My parents don't know most of what happened. My mother would lie awake worrying. My father would go quiet in the specific way he goes quiet when something he built has been threatened, and I didn't want to put that in him. They're in Kelowna now, and when I call my mother on Sunday evenings, she asks about the maple tree, and I tell her it's fine. It came through the winter fine. It always does. The house still smells like lemon oil on old hardwood, cedar from the hallway closet, coffee from the same corner of the same kitchen. My father's 30 years are in the walls. My mother's hands are in the tiles. The keys are where they belong, on the hook by the back door, right where my mother put them the day she showed me how to arm the security system and told me the override code and made me write it down in 2 places, because she knows I lose things. That hook is mine. This door is mine. Not because I deserve it more than anyone, or because ownership is something worth being proud of in itself, but because 2 people decided that the thing they had spent their lives building was the most important thing they could give to someone they loved. And they gave it to me, and I will not be careless with it. Not for anyone.